Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Men and Cars, the podcast where we talk about the history of motorsport with or without men. Welcome back, guys. Another week, another episode. I think we are on episode 7 now, which is crazy. Crazy times. I can't believe how quickly the time has gone. It's crazy, but yeah, we're getting through topics thick and fast. I need to start thinking of not better ones, that's a wrong word. I'm going through the good ones relatively quickly. So if you guys have, any suggestions, drop me a message and I might take you up on it. So this week, of course, it is a week about women's motorsport, and I can't believe I didn't do this earlier, but we cannot talk about women's motorsport without talking about Michèle Mouton. Now, if you don't know who she is, she was a rally driver during the 1980s who competed in the World Rally Championships and won 4 of those events with her co-driver, Fabrizia Pons. And she was most known for the very particular era, which was the Group B era. And I'll go into kind of the specifics of that, but it was a really kind of iconic time for rallying. It really kind of captured the imagination of the public in a very similar way to kind of what Formula One was doing. So it was really popular at the time, and I'll go into, again, why that was and how she kind of contributed to this. But it's a really fascinating kind of period of motorsport. So as I said before, Michèle Mouton is known as kind of the most successful, or one of the most successful women in motorsport history. So lots of kind of articles really kind of measure this by thinking, what do women in motorsport today or in very recent years what benchmark do they set for themselves to kind of judge their success or their skills? And often people do this by comparing to Michèle Mouton or Pat Moss as well, who was also a very successful rally driver. I think I'll do an episode on her in a few weeks' time, but that really just shows what an impact she had on the world of motorsport, being known really as that benchmark, and also that's very reflective of how kind of open motorsport is to women nowadays, seeing as she was competing, what was it, like over 40 years ago, so I'll go into kind of the dynamics of her being a woman in motorsport towards the end of this episode, but it is really interesting the way that she approaches this, or the way she because she's still alive today and is very active in motorsport and female motorsport, but it's really interesting seeing how she kind of views the progression of female motorsport since she was at her peak, and how she also viewed that at the time as well. So Michèle's life has kind of been in discussion kind of in quite recent years, because there was a documentary that came out called The Queen of Speed, which is on Sky, I believe. Also, don't tell anyone, but it's on YouTube. But I would highly recommend watching it. It's really good. I think it won, is it an Emmy? It won some awards for sports documentaries, so it's very well done. Lots of kind of archival footage, and she kind of narrates it throughout as well. So it's a really well kind of thought out or well documented story of her life, and really kind of puts perspective to her achievements whilst kind of talking about them within a closer or a more equal context of motorsport or rallying, in terms of how she compared to her male counterparts, but also how people reacted to her being a woman in motorsport at the time. And if you watch it after this, you will notice I took a lot of notes from it, but it explained it very well, particularly if you don't, or you aren't that familiar with rallying. I was not really at all before I researched this episode, but it kind of, explains the rules in a very good way, or makes doing further research a lot easier, I found. Right, so let's get into the episode. So Michèle Mouton was born in 1951, and she grew up in the south of France in Grasse. So she started driving kind of age 14, and she had a very kind of vibrant social life and was really kind of involved in her schoolwork. She was going to study law if she wasn't a driver. So driving was really kind of like a hobby. She would kind of take her dad's Citroen 2CV, like when she would go out like dancing, and in the morning she would go and try and find like the most twisty, like difficult roads to go and practice driving. So it was really like a fun hobby for her. And as much as her dad was also really passionate about cars, I think her parents were probably, maybe rightly so, kind of, you know, cautious about wanting her to have kind of a good education. And if she was really talented at driving, then they would allow her to pursue it. So in 1972, that's when her kind of driving and competition really started. So her friend asked her to drive as a kind of co-driver in the Tour de Corse, which was a Monte Carlo rally. And she really then kind of discovered that competitive driving was her thing, really. She hadn't really, given it much thought before. It was just, again, a hobby that she enjoyed. So after being a kind of co-driver and navigator for quite a while, Mouton's dad bought her a Renault Alpine A110 just to kind of see if she could kind of compete in competition as a driver instead, and see if that would be kind of worthwhile as a career. She very quickly found that she was obviously extremely talented at this, and from then on her dad kind of definitely supported her career, because she had, proved that she was very much able of holding her own in competitions. So she then went on to compete in kind of women's only competitions, so the French Ladies Championship and the French GT Class Championship. Now these, she says in the documentary, she did not find them kind of terribly challenging. I mean, particularly ladies only competitions at the time, they were, a lot more casual, simply because there were not that many women competing in motorsport at the time. So competing in those kind of gave her that bit of experience, that bit of practice. But like most women in motorsport, the goal was to compete amongst men or compete at their level. So as her career kind of progressed, she did have a lot of success in competitions amongst men. So she finished kind of 12th overall in the 1974 Tour de Corse, with her male rivals really like accusing her of cheating, and this led to her cars being really kind of like picked apart by marshals and kind of heavily checked, a lot more than her opponents, which, is a fairly obvious kind of sign that they were not used to women kind of competing that well. And she also had a class win in the kind of 1975 24 Hours of Le Mans, where she competed in an all-women's team as well, I believe. So her career was kind of obviously gaining a lot of traction. So during her early years in motorsport, she was driving for Fiat, but she was finding it a bit kind of difficult. But she was also backed by Elf, so the French oil company, which were obviously very prominent in motorsport. So before kind of the 1980s, French manufacturers were really dominant in motorsport, so it made a lot of sense for them to sponsor Michèle, as she's French herself. But what really changed her kind of career was her involvement with Audi. So that kind of started the Group B era of rallying. So before I get into kind of Mouton's career specifically, I wanted to kind of talk a bit more about rallying in general and how it kind of played out in the 1980s, or the time when she was most prominent, because it is really specific and probably one of the most well-known eras of rallying, which probably, made her career a lot more memorable, not just because of her gender and her difference to the other drivers, but also there's that combination of all those elements that made her so exceptional as a kind of figure, I imagine, in general culture. So the Group B era is an era where there was kind of a new set of regulations in terms of what cars were allowed in rallying or in the World Rallying Championship. So this was from the years about 1982 to 1986. Not about, it was 1982 to 1986. So the main difference was the introduction of four-wheel drive cars. So this was opposed to rear-wheel drive cars. So this meant that the transmission system was providing power to all four wheels instead of just the rear wheels. So this was very effective in rallying in particular because it provided a lot better kind of traction and grip for the really varying terrains that rally events would be held in. So it's not like other forms of motorsport where there was a very kind of, smooth, inoffensive kind of track. The whole point of this championship was to provide that sort of challenge to their drivers. So the four-wheel drive cars really enabled much higher speeds to be carried and obviously much more exciting competition for the spectators as well. So these cars were kind of really powerful and really exciting, so they could carry up to 500 brake horsepower sometimes, and acceleration this was on a gravel road as well, was from kind of 0 to 60 miles an hour in about 2.3 seconds, so incredibly powerful. And when this kind of new form of car was introduced, loads and loads of manufacturers thought that these new kind of regulations would be far too complicated and all these companies wouldn't be able to catch up and any competition would kind of be completely dissipated. But obviously they were wrong, and the exact opposite happened. The competition was extremely popular. So the first team to introduce these new types of cars was Audi. So as I said before, kind of French manufacturers were really dominant in motorsport. So when Audi came onto the scene, they're a German manufacturer, and they brought out the Audi Quattro, which, after that doubt of how effective four-wheel drive cars would be, they were seen with kind of immediate success and really kind of flushed out any doubts about the practical ability of four-wheel drives in rallying. So that new feature with those regulations combined with their new kind of turbocharged engine meant that they were an extremely quick team, and driving for them would pretty much, guarantee that you would have a very good chance at challenging for the championship win. So Audi won manufacturer's title in 1982 and 1984, as well as driver's titles in 83 and 84 as well. So they were dominant for those few years, but eventually other manufacturers caught on to these techniques. So by the kind of later years of the Group B era, competition was extremely fierce. Now, although this style of racing was obviously good for the manufacturers, for the drivers, everyone wants a more powerful car to improve their times, to beat their opponents, and also for the spectators. As I said earlier, it was really rivaling Formula One in terms of popularity. But as you can guess, this was extremely dangerous. Like, really, watching the footage of these races is absolutely baffling how there were not more kind of fatalities, because it was really so the tracks were not really that much wider than the car themselves, and they were completely packed with spectators right up to the side of the thing. There were no kind of barriers. People were just kind of standing right in the middle of the tracks and just stepping aside when the car came hurtling towards them. So it is really quite terrifying to watch. And a particular point of how kind of dangerous being a spectator is that a lot of people would try and touch the cars, and this is really disgusting, so I'm sorry, but people would touch these cars, and because they have lots of grates, divots, their fingers would get stuck and sometimes be pulled off. So in the documentary there was footage of people's fingers that the engineers had to remove from the cars, which was really gross. I did not expect it. I mean, I'm not actually surprised that it happens. I just, when I was watching that documentary on a Tuesday morning, it was maybe not what I wanted to see, but, But that just really shows, people knew that would kind of happen, I suppose. It was kind of a given. I mean, you don't have to be a genius to find that if you stand in the path of a car going at those speeds, it might be dangerous. But I think that obviously really added to the thrill of why people loved motorsport. And in other categories such as Formula One, you couldn't really get that close. So I suppose it felt like a much more kind of personal, or a much more kind of immersive experience for spectators, I imagine. So from that side, there was a lot of kind of danger and risk involved, but what really kind of made the Group B era end for good was in 1986 there were a lot of incidents, or two that stick out in particular. So in the stage 4 of the championship in Portugal, Joaquim Santos's Ford RS200 lost control and ran into the crowd in a speed test. So 3 people unfortunately passed away and 30 people were injured. So at this stage in the competition, although it was obviously a huge loss and a huge tragedy, the championship kind of as a whole was not cancelled at that point. It was, a lot of teams withdrew from that event in particular, but the event that made a more kind of concrete steps to be taken to improve safety was by the 17th stage. Henry Toivonen, who was racing for Lancia at the time, were performing very well at that point, and they were really kind of fighting for the championship win. But unfortunately, they crashed off the side of the mountain, and the car kind of immediately burst into flames. And unfortunately, him and his co-driver Sergio Cresta were killed instantly. So this was obviously a huge incident, especially with those two being in the mix for competing for the championship. It was a really big event, and this then caused the FIA to announce that Group B cars would be banned in the future as they were far too fast to kind of compete safely. So that was a kind of really definitive and obviously extremely tragic end to the Group B era, but despite having such a sudden and tragic end, people still look back at this era with so much kind of, excitement and intrigue, and I think that maybe is what makes it so kind of iconic and maybe exciting, even because it was such a short kind of space of time. But in rallying at that point, it was anything goes, just go as fast as you possibly can and with not many consequences. And I think that's what the drivers and the spectators really want from motorsport ultimately. So now we've kind of done a bit of a look over what rallying was like at that time and the dynamics of the Group B era. Let's get into the good stuff of Michèle Mouton's time in the World Rallying Championship. So in 1981, Michèle was asked by Audi to compete in the championship, and she was kind of extremely surprised by this, but obviously did not want to give up this opportunity. And I think a lot of it was that she couldn't really see why this German manufacturer would just want this random French driver. But looking back, and obviously I think she knew this at the time, but Audi, being a new team, really benefited from the marketing and PR advantages of having a female driver. If you're the only woman or one of the only women in a championship, all the eyes are going to be on you and which team wants to take you on. So it was really an ideal situation because she had an opportunity to kind of really experiment or further her career with this new car that had been developed. But Audi were perhaps also prepared to take on that risk that other teams weren't. So she was teammates with Hannu Mikkola, who was a really prominent driver as well in the championship. So they drove the new four-wheel Quattro, which was, when it was first introduced, it was obviously so much more powerful than all the other cars. So Mouton described it as taming a wild animal. So it was insanely fast. And they kind of knew at that point that it would really kind of change rallying. So that year she also became the first woman ever to win a WRC event, and that was at the San Remo Rally. And she then went on in 1982 to win 3 rallies in Portugal, Greece and Brazil, all in her Audi Quattro, which I believe had 350 brake horsepower. So in 1982, that was the year that is the most kind of notable in her career. So she won those 3 events, and by the penultimate event was really in the running to win the championship. So she was only 7 points behind the leader, who was Walter Röhrl, who was driving for Opel at the time. So by the time the kind of championship was drawing to a close, it was a really kind of make or break time for Mouton, kind of really high stakes, and she was so close to winning the entire championship, which would be an incredible achievement for her personally and also for Audi. So at this point, I think people were probably rooting more for Walter Röhrl to win. I think he would often speak out against Mouton's kind of talent, saying stuff like, you know, you could put a monkey in the Audi and it would win and stuff like that. I think there's a clip of him in the documentary saying he was very adamant in that he did not want to be the first man to lose against a girl. So you know, it would have been quite kind of a tense environment for Mouton, I imagine. So by the time it got to that penultimate and that last event, unfortunately, Mouton's father passed away. So she was considering kind of dropping out of the competition, but I think her and her mother kind of decided that it would have been what her dad wanted, to her to continue in the competitions. So she continued with the last two events, but unfortunately, after gaining a lead initially on Royal, she suffered kind of a long sequence of mechanical problems. So they had to have a replacement gearbox and fuel injector, radiator broke, as well as her drive shaft, and also on a few occasions her car just wouldn't start. So I think that, combined with probably the emotional toll kind of losing her father had on her, she lost out on winning the 1982 championship. So at this point, it's really interesting to see her kind of view on this, or how people viewed it, because I think people celebrate her maybe equally as much as they would have done if she had won the championship. I think it's definitely kind of like a landmark event of when she got runner-up in the championship. So it's really interesting. I don't think people kind of look back on her career and go, oh, she could have done it. I think it's very much celebrated as a huge achievement, which it definitely was. And I think for her, definitely, like, on a personal level, she said she didn't feel overly crushed on losing the championship. It was definitely, annoying, all those issues. She said the whole team was, frustrated and upset at the car. But for her as an individual, I think she said the pain of kind of losing her father was so much worse than missing out on the competition that it didn't really faze her too much. Yeah, she said, I don't mind about the championship, it was no comparison, and she very much had the attitude of, I tried, it didn't work, you move on. So it's really a very kind of like bittersweet moment, because I think she dealt with that time in the championship and that kind of bitter competition really incredibly well. I think that's all in her kind of driving style, and that's what I kind of admire from her personally as well. I think she had that attitude, which is a lot kind of more common in rally driving, because when you do a round of the track in a rally event, it's like there's only one car at a time. It's not like single-seater racing where you can see your opponents. You've got that added element of trying to overtake them, trying to defend against them. You don't really have that to think about. So even throughout the whole competition, you can be so kind of in your own bubble and only worry about your own times and self-improvement. So I think that really is in the nature of her attitude towards driving. She was very much focused on her own progress and not too concerned about beating her male opponents necessarily. I think she wanted to kind of race on par with them. Definitely, that was absolutely a goal for her, but I think in terms of winning events and winning championships, she really only wanted to improve her own personal times and work on that, which meant that I think the way she views her achievements or becoming a runner-up in the 1982 championship, she kind of views it a bit differently, which I think is a very positive thing, actually. So now we've kind of talked about her career. It's obviously a huge talking point of her career at the time, and now particularly in the documentary about her, was the aspect of being a woman that was competing very high up in motorsport. So what lots of people see most notable about her is that she really kind of disrupted an extremely masculine world of rallying, of motorsport. So obviously before that point, only men had won events in rallying. It was really not common for women to compete amongst men, particularly. As if you've listened to my episode on Brooklands, I talked a bit about kind of women's events that were held in the kind of early to mid 20th century, but it was a lot more common to have those events just for women to race together. But what Mouton did and what her goal was, or her motivation for succeeding, she really noted as to be accepted. So to have that opportunity to race amongst men, to kind of prove her own talent, perhaps more to herself. So although that was kind of her personal goal, from a spectator's or from a journalism point of view, she really kind of shook the world of rallying, or the world of motorsport in general, as so many of kind of her male competitors made such a kind of big deal about the fact that she was a woman. And it was, obviously they were not used to seeing women in that capacity, but the fact that she was very capable of beating them obviously made them extremely insecure. And a lot of them include Ari Vatanen, who was the 1981 world champion, and said that he would stop rallying if he was ever beaten by a woman. And surprise, surprise, he was beaten by a woman, but he didn't retire. Lol. So you've also got her 1982 competitor, Walter Röhrl, who also made remarks, or kind of threw a bit of a hissy fit over the fact that he didn't want to be beaten by a woman. But it was also kind of the competition runners, or the, not judges, but like adjudicators, that would kind of pick her apart a bit more, or the media would kind of really question her motivations, or what she could have done to be able to be picked up by such a big team. So obviously people made assumptions that she was, had only been able to drive this great car because of who she was sleeping with at the time, or something like that. So, but she really, I think, just kept her motivations and her goals really centred towards herself, and just proving that she could be at their level and drive the same car and improve her times, which she did. So it really wasn't, there wasn't any kind of concrete evidence anyone could have taken to undermine her skills, but people definitely tried. So in the documentary, a lot of her competitors, including Röhrl and Vatanen, gave interviews as well, and they were, did admit that they had said these things about her being a woman and perhaps poking fun at that, but they did conclude, and again, I don't know if they were just saying this because they had a camera in front of them and it was a documentary about her, but, they did describe her as really being a pioneer and really, again, awakening the rally world and being a really unforgettable kind of force in motorsport. And this was really on account of the fact that she was such a talented driver, not just the fact that she was a woman. And again, this is true for a lot of women in motorsport, but being a woman and being proud of that and making everyone aware of that is very important, I think, personally. But you've got that combination of having recognition for their actual skills that, particularly in those times, really kind of needed to be prioritised almost, because obviously you've got so many more people who you need to really fight to be taken seriously against. So yeah, I think Michèle Mouton at this time was really focused on being the best driver she could. She didn't kind of go on great lengths to talk about the fact that she was a woman in rallying. Of course, people would ask her a lot. It's a very big talking point, as you can imagine. But I think, again, she was very centred on beating her own goals and not so focused on all these kind of landmark achievements or winning trophies, etc. This was really kind of interesting in the documentary in particular, because she kept all her trophies kind of like in a box in the garage, and compared to her kind of teammate Fabriaza Pons, who still actually is competing in rallying now, which is crazy, but she's got a big trophy case, and which is obviously fine, but I just think it's really interesting to see her kind of state of mind, or how she viewed motorsport or her achievements. So after coming runner-up in the 1982 championship, Michèle Mouton kind of continued to race for 4 more years and gained a few more achievements, such as being the first and only woman to win and also set a new time at the Pikes Peak Hill Climb event, which is in the US, and that was kind of a similar dynamic to her time in the WRC. So, organisers and officials were really kind of suspicious of how fast she actually was and tried to kind of accuse her of rule infringements, but obviously that didn't have any substance to it. So after that, she eventually retired in 1986 to kind of start a family. And in more kind of recent years, in 2010, she started working as the president of the FIA Women in Motorsport Commission. So she's still kind of involved in the world of motorsport, particularly in the side of women's motorsport, which I think is really good. And, you know, as much as she is very kind of modest about her achievements, I think she is really passionate and really keen for other women to continue her kind of legacy, if you will, or match or kind of further her records. And this is definitely kind of noted on quite a lot, is that there hasn't since really been a woman in motorsport that's achieved those kind of achievements, which is really kind of, it really puts Michèle Mouton's achievements, or what her role was in continuing the progress of women in motorsport. So as of now, it's kind of 41 years since she came runner-up in the 82 championship, and it's really kind of interesting and almost kind of a bit discouraging to see how people are kind of viewing that. I think the time that she was most prominent is seen as kind of this like mystical like era that can't really be touched and can't really be kind of replicated, which I don't think it should kind of be seen like that. I think even though it happened such a long time ago, it shouldn't be seen as this kind of achievement that is so untouchable and like, you know, she's the only one to do it. It's kind of like a, I don't know how to explain it, but kind of like some mystical story that like cannot be done again, which obviously is not the case. Like, I really hope that soon there will be someone else who will achieve that same notoriety. And I mean, there are loads of women in motorsport at the moment that have every, you know, opportunity or every possibility of reaching that. And perhaps the fact that, you know, with kind of F1 Academy and more women competing in stuff like IndyCar and rallying or Le Mans as well, maybe just the increased volume of women competing in motorsport will prevent one really iconic, notable figure. So who knows what the future may hold, but it is certain that Michèle Mouton's like experience, the way that she approached her sport and the impact she had on motorsport culture is extremely kind of positive for women in sports in general. Anyway, so that is all I have for this week's episode. I hope you have enjoyed. Please follow on Spotify, Apple Podcast, subscribe on YouTube, and also follow on Instagram and TikTok. I'll try and find some good clips. There are quite a lot, because I'm struggling on the TikTok front, guys. You know, there's not a lot of clips going about. I'm not very savvy on social media, unfortunately, but if you would like to see some more photos to go along with this episode, follow me on Instagram. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you all next week. Again, hope you enjoyed. Have a good week, and I will see you then. Bye.